โมตัสสะภะคะวะโตอะระหะโตสัมมาสัมพุทธัสสะนะโมตัสสะภะคะวะโตอะระหะโตสัมมาสัมพุทธัสสะนะโมตัสสะภะคะวะโตอะระหะโตสัมมาสัมพุทธัสสะพุทธังธัมมังสังฆังนะมัสสามิ Blessings, good evening. They have a saying that when you're with other people, you have to guard your speech and your actions because they will influence how things go with the other people around you. When you're on your own, you have to guard your thoughts. Because even when we're totally alone, we can make ourselves miserable, stressed, unhappy, afraid, simply by following different trains of thought that are rooted in what we call mental defilement, kilesa. Different formations of greed, anger, delusion. And anyone who's practiced meditation and practiced it on their own will know this. You can be totally alone with very little external stimulus, but because you can remember things and your mind brings up different thoughts and emotions as you're meditating, you can find yourself elated, happy, maybe even laughing sometimes, laughing to yourself. Sometimes you can find yourself very sad, crying. Sometimes you can find yourself very angry. Sometimes just kind of dull. Sometimes depressed, disappointed. So many different mental states and emotions come up. And maybe physically you're just sitting in a room or a place all on your own. That in itself is quite, sometimes at least, humorous. We say we do it to ourselves. So we have to be especially mindful when we're on our own. One of the biggest problems with mindfulness practice, meditation, and Buddhism in general is often we like to train and put forth effort in our practice. So we do acts of dana and generosity in different ways. We help others. We find that quite satisfying and brings us some happiness. Maybe we even determine to keep precepts, 5 precepts, 8 precepts. And for periods, often just short periods of time, we take on meditation and try sitting and walking, and meditation to calm the mind, relax the mind, meditation to develop insight, vipassana. But then we don't sustain it. So for those short periods of time, we are practicing and we're careful and we put forth effort. But then when you finish your formal meditation period, for however long it was, 5-10 minutes or 1 hour, then you kind of let things go. And we kind of say, I put all my effort, and maybe you gain something from that. But then we tend to relax and not sustain or maintain the effort. Or you might say we drop our guard and everything comes flooding back into the mind. Probably the worst one would be if you meditate regularly, even put forth a lot of effort for a period of time each day to practice mindfulness, develop insight into what we call vipassana, the 3 characteristics: impermanence, unsatisfactoriness, not self. There are techniques that you may have learned and heard about and read about, You do that, but afterwards, not only do you let your guard down in terms of watching over your mind, but maybe you don't even continue with the precepts. So some people's practice of precepts and being careful of their speech, their actions, is just when they're meditating. They're careful not to say much. Well, you don't usually talk much when you meditate. Not to do things, when you're meditating, you don't generally go and kill things or steal anything. But then afterwards, just completely not pay much attention to speech and actions. So anything is possible. So of course, what monks tend to call it is it's like playing a game of snakes and ladders. You go up a bit from putting forth this effort in meditation and maybe keeping precepts for a while. But then when you let off your guard, you're not watching over your mind, you're not particularly interested in keeping precepts, say on a daily basis, then we get caught into more unskillful habits again of speech, action, do things that maybe hurt others, hurt ourselves, and you're slipping down the snake. For anyone, younger person listening, they may not understand this because snakes and ladders is not such a popular game now. It's a board game, one of those old-fashioned board games. But the idea is you go up the ladder and you fall down the snake. The reason I brought this one up is because it's summer here, or the beginnings of summer. The weather is warming up and the snakes start to come out in the monastery. So every time I see a snake, first thing I want to do is not step on it. But here we're talking more about the snakes and ladders of the mind. And if you don't look after your mind on a regular basis, well, whatever gains you get from your meditation, you can easily lose and go backwards. One step forward, two steps back. And a lot of the frustration, the complaints we hear from people are really expressions of frustration with that aspect of their Dhamma practice and their training of the mind. Sometimes they don't realize, sometimes we're just not paying attention enough, or we haven't heard enough Dhamma or learned enough to realize. Sometimes people realize, but they don't want to admit it. So we have this one step forward, two steps back, or up the ladder, down the snake all the time, and this up and down is quite hard work, and sometimes in the end the snakes win, the two steps back wins, and you give up altogether because you feel like, I'm just not getting anywhere in my practice. So we need to be patient and keep going. And we need to remind ourselves of the Buddha, the Dhamma, the Sangha, over and over again. What we call Buddhanusati, Dhammanusati, Sanghanusati, recollecting the qualities of Buddha, qualities of Dhamma, qualities of Sangha. Because the Buddha, fully awakened Buddha, the Dhamma is the teaching and the path of practice, pointing to the truth. And then Sangha, those noble ones who have practiced and realized the fruits of the practice. These are where we'll draw some extra energy and patience to deal with the snakes, treading on the snakes, slipping down, going backwards. We need to be patient sometimes, even when we're very tired or exhausted or ill, even when we put forth effort and we're unable to sustain the effort we were sustaining previously, but not to slip back so far that you disregard your precepts or give up on the practice or give up on meditation. Sure, sometimes we put forth a lot of energy and effort and try to maintain really good levels of mindfulness, for example, in all postures for long periods of time. Other times we can't sustain that, but when we can't sustain our practice or our effort in the practice, the precepts are supposed to be like a bottom line that you don't cross. however tired you are, however angry you are, however sad you are, whatever the distractions in your mind, whatever desires are coming up, your precepts are your sort of baseline that you try not to get cross or give into or go across. And that's one way you do get more effort, energy and patience in your practice, by developing the attitude of trying to keep your precepts in any situation at any time. So that will naturally bring up a certain amount of effort and also understanding, wisdom in how to keep the precepts in the different situations you face. And it will stop you slipping quite so far back on the snakes of life if you're keeping the precepts. Once you don't keep the precepts, and they say like the doors to the lower realms are opened, and then anything can happen, and you can act in any way, any unskillful way. There's no more patience, no more restraint, no more mindfulness. Well, you can do anything or say anything, which actually is a very dangerous place to be. The precepts are your best friend in terms of training your mind, following the Buddhist practice, and bringing your mind closer to the Buddha, the Dhamma, the Sangha. The precepts are vital, they're fundamental. Most of us don't start our practice with the precepts. We have faith in the Buddha, Dhamma, Sangha. Maybe we practice dana, go to temples and monasteries and make offerings. Or we join meditation retreats maybe and learn techniques of meditation, samatha meditation, vipassana meditation. But precepts are often the last thing people come to. Whether you're coming from the dana practice or the meditation practice, you sort of meet in the middle with precepts. And it's getting to realize the value of them as a way to sustain effort on a daily basis, even when you find your mind is a bit distracted or your effort in other areas drops. If you can keep the precepts, you find that has a very purifying, energizing effect on your mind, and it helps you to develop wisdom. The wisdom, the understanding how to keep the precepts when faced with temptations, situations that draw out your impatience, your anger, draw out your greed, your desire, draw out your confusion, that lead you to break the precepts. How to maintain the precepts under those kind of challenges and temptations. You actually become much wiser. Partly because you need to see the value of keeping the precepts under any circumstances, because you need to see how they condition the mind, they're supporting the mind to help you abandon unskillful ways of speech and action. You need to really value that, and then you'll put more effort, give them more commitment, and put more effort into the training of and keeping of precepts. If you haven't seen their value, well then it's hard to commit to them, and you may, like most of us, when you start practicing the Dhamma, you keep them sometimes and you don't others. But at some point you've got to make that realization, that leap where you say, oh, if I don't keep the precepts, I do keep taking one step forward, two steps back, or treading on the snake. And my mind goes back to a much coarser state, and I get angry, and then I feel regret, or I do something in greed which is not very correct, or not very helpful, not very appropriate. But you're having to deal with the greed, the guilt and the regret. When you finally realize it's just better to keep the precepts, whatever, and maybe miss out on certain small pleasures that may lead you to break precepts, or miss out on revenge on somebody in terms of anger, or on an animal or an insect. You just realize better to keep the precepts than break them, whatever the circumstances. Then you start to have that sense of commitment, and you have a more solid foundation. Then you start to climb the ladders more than tread on the snakes. Doesn't mean to say your mind is free from mental defilement, but the more you value the precepts and see their role in training the mind, the more you'll have that experience of more successes rather than failures and disappointments, whether we're talking about meditation or just general well-being. Coming to respect Buddha, Dhamma, Sangha, both as ideals, but then also just the qualities that they represent, and then committing to develop those same qualities. Again, that's like keeping the precepts. You're just getting to the point where you have respect for Buddha, Dhamma, Sangha. It's just natural for you to think of Buddha, Dhamma, Sangha in the way you think, the way you make decisions, and the way you live your life and guide your life, the sort of choices you make. It's also another area where sort of commitment becomes stronger, where you just naturally want to follow the Buddha, remember the Buddha, naturally follow the Dhamma, you might say the Noble Eightfold Path, naturally aspire to incline towards the Sangha, both living Sangha but also the qualities that the Sangha represents, such as the Sila, Samadhi, Panya, the good practice of the Sangha. As you practice, you may get to a point where you just find it much easier to commit to Buddha, Dhamma, Sangha on a daily basis, on a permanent kind of moment to moment, moment by moment basis. Doesn't mean to say you're enlightened or you're beyond doubt, but you have enough experience that you realize committing to Buddha, Dhamma, Sangha has no disadvantages to you. You're willing to do it, and that will pull along, like the precepts, it will pull out all kinds of other good qualities. Even in meditation, you're committing to Buddha, Dhamma, Sangha, maybe you use the recollection of the Buddha as one of your meditation objects. Buddha, Buddha, Buddha. Reciting Itipiso, or maybe just sometimes you're thinking of the Buddha, who the Buddha was, what the Buddha did, the qualities of a Buddha, based on whatever information you have, as you might say, a more discursive meditation, but just keeping your mind on that one theme, the Buddha, or the Dhamma, or the Sangha. And not only do you gain more peace of mind doing that, but you also gain more commitment to everything that the Buddha, Dhamma, Sangha stands for. I don't just mean you're willing to bow, physically bow to a Buddha image. That's the beginning step. But actually using recollection of the Buddha, Dhamma, Sangha in the way you lead your life. So maybe having that thought, well, what would the Buddha think of this, or what did the Buddha say about this when you have to make decisions? So thinking about karma in particular, good karma, bad karma, what is it? What kind of karma am I making in each situation? So it's particularly useful, say, when you're under pressure or stress from life and you're tempted to say or do something that would hurt someone else or hurt yourself even. But you think of Buddha, you think of Dhamma, you think of Sangha, and there's just enough there to stop you acting on an impulse or an intention that's arisen, but something is there that says, oh, this is bad karma. By thinking of the Buddha, you get that reflection, you get that wisdom. Some people think, oh, Buddha, Dhamma, Sangha, well, these are just samatha objects. It's not vipassana, but really the Buddhist path is a very complete path. It involves sila, samadhi, panya, and vipassana can only be practiced when purified by good sila, precepts. Vipassana can only really be practiced for complete liberation with some commitment towards Buddha, Dhamma, Sangha as well. It's not a completely secular sort of thing that you can just divorce or separate off from the Buddhist teachings if you're going to do it successfully, because it necessarily draws you closer to the Buddha Dhamma Sangha. But the essence of Buddha Dhamma Sangha, not simply the externals, sort of saying I believe in, I worship Buddha Dhamma Sangha, but the heart of Buddha Dhamma Sangha is, the wisdom that sees the conditioned nature of this mind and our experience, and letting go of greed, anger and delusion, because these are conditioning forces that bring you suffering. You might say letting go of all that brings you suffering and leads on to suffering and is suffering, letting go of that. That's what the Buddha Dhamma Sangha stands for in in essence. But in the beginning it may be more just committing to keeping precepts, using meditation techniques, reflecting on Dhamma teachings that you've heard and do hear. There's many levels of commitment and many levels of understanding Buddha Dhamma Sangha. But you can't really practice vipassana, meditation, insight into impermanence or not self, without also investigating and developing some commitments to the Buddha, the Dhamma, the Sangha, I would say. It comes together. You may begin your Buddhist journey, say, following a vipassana course, and many of us do. But over time, you can't help but sort of broaden your approach, I think, from simple techniques of insight meditation, reflecting on impermanence, reflecting on not self, to broadening your faith, your understanding of what the Buddha, the Dhamma, the Sangha means on a deeper level, and using them. I mean, they're refuges, they're not simply to be believed in, they're to be used as in you gain so much by recollecting the qualities of the Buddha Dhamma Sangha. As I was saying earlier, in a simple reflection at any time when you're faced with some stressful situation or a difficult choice to make, some course of action you have to decide on. If you prefer, some people will like to think of, well, if the Buddha was here, what would the Buddha say? What would the Buddha do? Or you're a teacher, maybe you have a respected teacher, monk, nun, lay teacher, lay man, lay woman, doesn't matter. What would this teacher do in this situation? They may not be there, but just recollecting them, thinking of them, can help stimulate your own good qualities, your own restraint, your own mindfulness, your own insight. And you make a decision as if they were there guiding you, but you're using your own understanding on whatever level you've developed in your practice. Sometimes you remember words, like, particular teachings you've received or heard. Sometimes it's more just the presence of that teacher or the Buddha, whatever has previously sort of brought you some good feeling, emotional stability, feeling of peace, feeling of happiness. It's something you can bring to mind from the past experience in a situation when you're maybe stressed or struggling. A good example is somebody who's ill, seriously ill. How do they cope with that when they're physically in a lot of pain, maybe very weak, maybe having to undertake different procedures, surgery, or take a lot of medication? Someone in that situation, often they're really under pressure mentally to keep their mind in a good state. They're often overwhelmed by fears and anxieties and worries. Often have lots of memories pop into the mind because the mind is the body and the mind are weak. All kinds of memories, dreams, daydreams, imagination can take over very easily. You notice when people get really ill, particularly at the end of their life, towards the end of their life, often they're given medication to sort of really calm them down. But what if you could maybe deal with that or face that with more innate qualities of mindfulness and compassion and some insight that you've already practiced in your life, and maybe if you've already developed a regular practice, when you face such a situation, and who knows if you ever will have to or when it would happen, but if you have got a basis in practice and you have some faith in Buddha Dhamma Sangha, maybe it's at that moment that you'd really value it. I've seen many people facing such a situation either in hospital or at home or in a monastery, and they say they draw so much strength and calm and insight from just remembering the Buddha. It's like one thing leads on to another. You can say it's a process of cause and effect. And, you remember the Buddha, and then you start to remember the Buddha's teachings. Whether you are somebody who's read a lot, or you recite through chanting, or you just meditated a lot, and by bringing your attention to your meditation object, brings you also close to the Buddha, the Dhamma, the Sangha. There's different ways it can happen, or ways you look after yourself in such a situation. But by doing that, you bring your mind back to the Buddha, back to the Dhamma, or back to the Sangha. Suddenly you get all these positive qualities kind of like released or stimulated or supported to deal with whatever the difficult situation is. I remember one doctor I knew who in a later part of her life got cancer, which eventually killed her, but she knew for many months ahead that she was in a situation of terminal illness. Eventually had to leave home, just live in the hospital, receiving medication, but because she was somebody with a foundation of Buddhist practice, that became the center of her life and the center of her happiness, center of what gave meaning to her life at that time. Obviously there are other things like friends visiting, family visiting, other things like that, but nothing much else. Material pleasures, good food and whatever the world has to offer in terms of recreation, entertainment. No, it didn't have much use for somebody who was dying and knew they were dying because they were medically trained. Whereas meditation and reflecting on the Buddha brought that person a lot of happiness, peace, tangible feelings of peace, tangible happiness at a time when the body was in great pain and getting skinnier and weaker every day. Basically, she was starving to death because the cancer meant she couldn't digest food. To the point where people would go and see her and just say, thought I was going to see somebody who's very unhappy, depressed, weak, but she lying on, very skinny body, lying on or occasionally sitting up when she had strength, sitting on her hospital bed, seemed much more happier than me. That was a very common response from her friends, family when they went to visit. And they'd ask, how come you can be so calm? She said, well, my faith in Buddha Dhamma Sangha brings me a feeling of peace. It's a refuge, it's what I think of, it's what I go to in my mind when I'm facing pain, when I'm facing depressing thoughts, when I start worrying about the future, this and that. It's the Buddha, the Dhamma, the Sangha that makes me understand what's important, what's not. And that person was Thai, and so in Thailand they have a great understanding or belief in to start with, and then understanding later in this concept of merit, bun, punya, skillful dhammas. And just the thought of the Buddha, the Dhamma, the Sangha is a very powerful thought that brings with it some happiness, peace, that is tangible even when the body is in a lot of pain and very uncomfortable and probably a very miserable place to be for someone in that situation. And yet the mind can still find some joy in life in the Buddha Dhamma Sangha. And she was a good example of that. She was someone with merit. So nobody saw her get angry. Perhaps she did momentarily, we don't know, but not any obvious displays of anger or depression or grief. Very sober might be one way of describing her, and that sometimes doesn't sound very good. Well, people don't like to be sober, they like to be intoxicated with life and the excitement and the passions and the happinesses and pleasures of life. We often associate that with the best that life can offer. But actually being sober perhaps is better. And sober towards the real challenge of life, which is the fact that we all get old, get sick and have to die. So she met that challenge very well with this kind of sober, calm state, and she just said truthfully, whenever people asked, her happiness comes from Buddha Dhamma Sangha, from practicing meditation, but also just recollecting Buddha Dhamma Sangha and seeing that everything else can be let go of. You can let go of your worries, your even pain, certainly pain that you can't get rid of, that you have to put up with. Well, at least you can let go of the aversion, the grudge. Probably the most common reaction when people have a long-term pain in illness is like, why me? I don't deserve this. Or what did I do to have this happen? It's not fair. We take it all out either on ourselves or other people if they can't cure us, or we run to the pain-killing drugs, the morphines and the other things that will help just blot it out of our consciousness. But at the same time, our consciousness tends to go down with it, unfortunately. But rather than doing all that, somebody having enough mindfulness to be with the pain and the obvious end-of-life experience, but just to be calm, peaceful, realizing that there's a higher happiness, the happiness of Buddha Dhamma Sangha and everything that stands for. A mind that is paying attention, not going into negative states of stress, unhappiness. That's just one example, one person I knew, so a very inspiring way to die, you might say. It took place over a number of months in a hospital. But you can take exactly the same principle and apply it to so many other things, can't you? Rather than always giving in to every challenge, every little bit of pain and discomfort, every little bit disappointment in life. Somebody lets you down, life lets you down, you don't get what you want, things don't go the way you were expecting, the unexpected things of life. Rather than just giving into everything, you come back to Buddha Dhamma Sangha. And what did the Buddha say? Everything is impermanent. Nothing is to be clung to. Nothing is self. If you don't make a self out of the disappointments, the failures, the pain, the problem, then the mind is peaceful, or can at least be peaceful with that difficulty that you may be encountering. So never underestimate the merit, the power of merit of recollecting Buddha Dhamma Sangha in every form, whether it's in a formal meditation or just daily life. Difficult times, go back to the Buddha Dhamma Sangha. For me, I've been doing that for 40, 45 years and never been disappointed once recollecting Buddha Dhamma Sangha. I have no more doubts about that. It is definitely the best thing you can bring into your mind. And everything else in life is kind of like, okay, not saying there's nothing else you can think of, nothing else you can do with your mind or your life, but it all takes second place to recollecting the Buddha, the Dhamma, the Sangha. And then, what is the essence of Buddha Dhamma Sangha? Well, mindfulness, insight, letting go of anything unwholesome, cultivating the wholesome, and seeing that ultimately all these things that we grasp hold of that are not Buddha Dhamma Sangha, they're just impermanent, they're not self, they're empty of self. Of course, where that really gels, where your sort of insight into Buddha Dhamma Sangha as a meritorious thought or mental state, or object of mind, you might say, where that really gels, comes together, is if you meditate, you really settle the mind, focusing on Buddha, Dhamma, Sangha, mindfulness from moment to moment to moment. Because the more mindful you are, the less these negative states of mind that we love to identify with can creep in and take over the mind. This sense of guarding over the mind. And not just when you're on your own, but when you're with other people as well. Both just equally important. When you really guard your mind with mindfulness, the unwholesome states, the negative states start to fade because they can't get a foothold, as it were. Then you can experience the peaceful mind, the calm, steady states of mind, the wholesome mind, this brighter, happier, better than before. And the sense of emptiness, the empty mind where it's just not needing anything else or trying to settle down or attach to anything else because it's happy within itself. The empty mind, in the Buddhist sense, is happy. It's not empty with a sense of despair or depression or something. It's empty as in empty of attachment to greed, anger and delusion. It's just free, it's just peaceful, knowing itself. The more often you experience that, the more your mind will incline to let go of what disturbs the empty mind, greed, anger, delusion. The less you'll identify with all the negative states that cause and have caused us so much suffering, the less likely you will be to tread on those snakes, and the more you'll go onto the ladder and go up the ladder, or the less you'll be taking 2 steps back, the more you'll be taking the 1 step forward. However slow, it doesn't matter as long as you're going forward. But this mind, that we say the empty mind, the peaceful, bright, happy mind, is so powerful like that. The most powerful kind of good karma or forerunner of the awakened mind, of the Buddha Dhamma Sangha. Maybe not yet the awakened mind, but it's on the way. It's a necessary step on the way. And sometimes you hear people practice vipassana, they say, oh, don't practice samadhi, you'll get attached to the bliss of samadhi. But it's not what the Buddha taught. The Buddha said, do practice and develop samadhi, do experience the bliss of samadhi. True, don't attach to it, it's still impermanent, it's not self, but do experience it. It's too easy to shy away from developing states of calm and samadhi by saying, oh, you'll get attached to them, don't bother, or they're dangerous. It's too easy an excuse not to put effort into your meditation. Maybe that's subtly another snake to step on. Because if you stop putting effort, well, you won't experience maybe the mind that goes beyond the 5 hindrances, the mind that is peaceful, calm, concentrated, and then insight won't really go very deep into your practice, seeing impermanence, seeing not self. So states of samadhi and calm are necessary. They are impermanent, so you have to also accept that. But you still use them. They're another rung on the ladder, and you want to go up the ladder, not down. So use them, develop them. And maybe for tonight I'll just say this much, and if anyone has any questions, can endeavour to answer them after this.